Aloha. Welcome to American Issues Take One. I'm Tim Apicella, your host, and today's title is Ukraine Left in the Dust. Trump Walks Away. It wasn't long ago that we witnessed Donald Trump in the Oval Office berating Vladimir Zelensky. It wasn't long ago that we saw Donald Trump text in social media that Zelensky started the war. The catastrophe that we saw in the Oval Office with both Vance and Trump ganging up on President Zelensky, stating in no many certain words that he was the problem, that he was the obstacle to ceasefire and peace, caught a lot of Americans by surprise. And then we had Marco Rubio join in on that and talking about if there's no progress of a ceasefire or anything in the negotiations, that maybe the United States would walk away. And it's only been in the last few days that we've seen an about face, or have we seen an about face, where Donald Trump has criticized Putin and basically has said that Putin now is the impediment to a ceasefire. So where does that bring us? Where does that take us to where we are today with Ukraine? What does the world think as they look at the United States with our back and forth support, lack of support for Ukraine? And what does this do to the United States' reputation in the world? And to discuss this topic, I have with me our esteemed guest, Ben Davis, professor at University of Toledo in law. And I have Chuck Crumpton, mediator extraordinaire. I always like to say mediator extraordinaire because he is. And I have with me my co-host, Jay Fidell. Jay, right to you. You know, we've been watching news reports of massive rocket, missile, drone strikes against Ukraine. The biggest strikes we've seen maybe in the last 3 years. And Donald Trump comes out and says he's not happy with Putin. And the quote is, he said, "I've known him for a long time, always gotten along with him. He's sending rockets into cities, killing people, and I don't like it at all. Also," he said, "Putin has gone absolutely crazy." Okay, so with this kind of social media rhetoric, where does that get Donald Trump to try to corral Vladimir Putin? Or does it do anything for Vladimir Putin? I argue it doesn't. Where does that bring us right now with support or the lack of support for Ukraine? Are we leaving Ukraine in the dust?
I want to talk about perspective for a minute. You know, I get 500 emails a day, and I delete probably 3/4, maybe 80% of them, maybe more, because I know that those are not important, and they're there to sell me something or to confuse me. And I think that's the way we have to look at the news coming out around Ukraine. I think it's a reality show. It's a reality show on both sides. But the bottom line is what, in fact, is happening. And what is happening is the United States is not supporting Ukraine, no matter what Trump says about how happy he is or unhappy. And Putin is in there using weapons that he has gotten from Iran or China or who knows where, using very modern technology, using fiber optic to direct these autonomous drones. Very effective. He's getting it from somewhere else. He says he developed it himself. I don't believe that. Anyway, what you have when you drain the swamp, so to speak, of all the misinformation and disinformation and confusion is Ukraine is losing, and Putin is winning, and the U.S. is standing, aside on a voluntary basis. You know, the U.S. isn't going to do anything. And I guess the question is, what is the reality? I think we can identify that here. And also, what are the implications? Where does it go from here? I mean, we had a lot of concern about him taking over the Baltics and the Balkans. We had a lot of concern about, him moving to the west side of Ukraine and then posing a threat to the rest of Europe and all that. And that, I think that still exists. And he's building, a USSR. Matter of fact, there's a group in Russia, probably works for him, who's now touting returning to the nomenclature USSR for Russia. So this reality show, which is straight out of The Apprentice, there's one thing it's guaranteed, gentlemen, one thing it's guaranteed. it gets to the top of the newspaper, of the headlines. If they said Trump is not supporting Ukraine, we'd get bored with that, wouldn't we? We heard that before, nothing new. But if he changes his tone and then he expresses unhappiness, and maybe next week he'll express happiness again, it keeps us interested. It keeps him at the top of the news cycle, and that's what he is all about, aside from the money. So all I'm saying is, from a perspective point of view, it is not exactly what it seems to be, and I think be very careful about accepting the news. For example, another example. There's an article in this morning's Times, I think, about dogs, and Ukrainians have found a lot of orphan dogs when families and buildings and infrastructure are destroyed. The dogs are let loose on the streets, and the Ukrainians are adopting the dogs. Very nice. I certainly admire that. And it shows that they care about the animals, whatnot. But that's not the bottom line. Everybody is interested in getting to the top of the news cycle, including Ukraine. And so we have to be very careful about what we accept and what we don't.
All right. Thank you, Jay. Ben, all the military experts, all the strategists say that if the United States walks away from Ukraine, we send a very clear and unambiguous message to China that, it's okay for you to go into Taiwan. The United States is a paper tiger. They won't stand up. They won't defend. It's just Donald Trump and words. Do you think they're right?
I think that they do have a point, because on Wall Street, on the financial side, right? They started using the phrase taco, right? For Trump always chickens out, right? And so that might start to be changed into ACO, which is America always chickens out, which is going to be a devastating vision of us that is going to be manifested by our current administration. So I think that China is probably smart enough to not all of a sudden invade Taiwan or something like that, but they're smart enough to do something that essentially makes Taiwan become part of China. It may take years, but kind of like with Hong Kong. Hong Kong was supposed to be 50 years independent, and we're now at year round 28, and it's essentially completely folded into the mainland. So there is another thing that, and I'm kind of going along with what Jay was saying here. I was watching the head of Finland being interviewed on TV, and he was saying that Putin made a strategic error. And when you hear about it, he's talking about the fact that the argument is made by Trump and by Putin is because Ukraine sought to be part of NATO, that's why Russia invaded. Well, the head of Finland, pointed out that Finland became a member of NATO after Putin invaded. And Finland has an 835-mile border with Russia. So the logic is completely bogus in that kind of an argument, that my invasion was okay when I had the strategic effect of creating a bigger NATO literally right up to my border with from Putin's point of view.
Let me jump in on that exact point. Putin has recently said, if you want me to agree to a ceasefire, I want in writing from the powers to be, meaning the United States at least, minimally, that there is a written agreement that Moldavia, Georgia, and Ukraine will not become members of a NATO alliance. So it must be somewhat important to Putin.
Let me jump in on you, Tim.
Yeah.
And that is, what's the real message in all of that? He knows he'll never get that agreement, ever, 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 ever. What he's really saying is, I don't want peace. Right. I'm going to put roadblocks in way of any discussion around peace. That's why he does this sort of thing.
He called the poison pill approach.
Right.
You're right.
If I could just add a thing on that, which is that I think somebody could respond back to him that, well, when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, I think everybody agreed to maintain its sovereignty. So, like, if we agree with you on this now, would you really, agree? Because he's completely blown through that particular agreement, which was crucial to Ukrainian giving up its nuclear weapons that it had. So yeah, it is just more vaporware, so to speak, to try to keep fighting, right? And, and if I can just add one last thing, is that I think, yes, the bottom line is that the United States is not helping militarily the Ukrainians. And it's a tragedy that we're not doing what we can to help them, giving them what they need. It is one of the worst tragedies I've seen in my life.
Agreed. Chuck, I think recently Donald Trump has admitted that he's provided and shielded Vladimir Putin. And he did so by saying that the following quote: what Vladimir Putin doesn't realize is that if it weren't for me, lots of bad things would have already happened to Russia. I mean, really bad. And then he further said he's playing with fire. So that's an admission that he's been covering for Putin in all these months. What are we to think about that? What would Donald Trump's motivation to be to side with Putin and give him cover, chastise the president of Ukraine in the Oval Office in front of millions of Americans, and then, as I said in the introduction, state that he started the war? What is this, some bizarre form of negotiations that Donald Trump is trying to employ as a strategy, or has he been providing cover for Putin because they're friends and there's some deep relationship there? Your thoughts?
Whether they're friends or not may not in this situation be as important as the commonality of orientation between them. They're both very, very transactional, quantitative, real estate, territorial, acquisitive, dictatorial leaders. That's how they measure stuff in territory acquired. Putin has proposed as conditions not only that states that he intends to territorially acquire control of cannot be considered for NATO, but that the areas of the Ukraine where Russia has gained some military intrusion and some measure of influence, that those are ceded to Russia as part of its territorial control, and that Ukraine becomes a neutral country, not aligned with anyone. So he wants to cut off all their defenses. That's exactly the same strategy that Trump uses domestically and would use internationally if he had either the influence or the intelligence or the resources to do it.
Okay, I'd like to ask you a kind of a follow-up, and that is, Putin seems to be immune to Donald Trump's words. I think Donald Trump thinks he can manipulate Vladimir Putin. Clearly, it's showing that he's not. What does Donald Trump do when all his attempts to, force Putin in a corner? Where does that put Donald Trump and his credibility of his campaign promise that I can end this in 24 hours? Does Donald Trump decide to walk away so he can, in his mind, save face? Because the negotiations are going nowhere, and throw it up in the air and leave it to Europe? Or does he stick to it and see if he can salvage what people thought he was going to be able to do from his bravado, is to solve the war in 24 hours? Obviously, that's not taking place, but does he stick it out? Does Donald Trump stick in there with J.D. Vance and try to get ceasefire and beyond there?
I think there's a connection that the media has not talked about yet. Whether they're missing it or whether they just don't want to talk about it, it's a different question. But there are people that Trump needs that are very strong Republican supporters of Ukraine. Lindsey Graham, Chuck Grassley, others. And he needs those people, he needs those votes for his domestic oppression policies, his transfer of wealth legislation under the guise of budget reconciliation.
Before the show started, I mentioned that Lindsey Graham and Chuck Grassley, like in a game of whack-a-mole, suddenly now appear to pop their heads out of the ground and start supporting Ukraine. Only because I think, and this is my opinion, maybe you agree, don't agree, that Donald Trump is start talking badly about Vladimir Putin. So they think there's some safe haven for them to spark up again. I think Chuck Grassley is trying to put a bill out there about, recommitment to Ukraine. Is this trend going to last more than a week? Donald Trump decides to once again turn his attention against Ukraine and pro Putin again. This back and forth shuttlecock of support is making the United States look like a horrible partner. Your thoughts to that?
Well, and if you combine that with what's happening in the bond market and the instability and uncertainty there, which has always been the crux of the foundation of any credibility of the U.S. economy, then you have a level of economic uncertainty that translates over into foreign policy. And the question is whether there are people who are going to take advantage of that, because they're not just talking about protection of Ukraine or protection against excessive budget deficits. They're talking about the basic economic stability of the country and its economic international stability. And I don't think we're hearing any confidence placed in Trump and his policies. So it's going to be interesting to see where that goes, because that could actually come up as a core element in Senate treatment and negotiations concerning the reconciliation bill.
Interesting. Okay, that's a good point. Thank you. Jay, the European Union is slow to unify on support for Ukraine. I know several countries are now trying to amend their budget to include military buildup, a budget for military expense. It's been said that will take years for them to build up any substantial military to support Ukraine in the field. Germany, I think, is finally meeting with Ukraine to possibly give them the long-range missiles that Germany has denied for all this time, even though the United States finally, gave in, and other countries have given in to give Ukraine longer-range missiles. The question is, if the United States walks away completely, can the EU fill the void that Donald Trump created?
No.
What's missing?
Ever since the Marshall Plan and the redevelopment of Europe after World War II, they have learned to be dependent on the U.S., and the U.S. has enjoyed that dependency. And Europe, to some extent, aside from its bureaucracy, has turned into a kind of powerhouse over the years. But that assumes that the U.S. has supported it, and the U.S. is no longer supporting it. That's very clear. And so, you're right to pose the question of can the EU do it by itself? Can NATO exist by itself? And the answer is probably not, because Europe doesn't know how to get together. One of the big problems and the reason that the UK left in Brexit was that there was too much bureaucracy, too much process going on in the EU, and they couldn't stand it anymore. That's one of a number of reasons. We can talk about that all day, but bottom line is that Europe doesn't know how to collaborate as a whole. Furthermore, you have some countries, as I mentioned before, in Europe that are going the other way. Take Hungary, for example, and there are others where Putin has laid his agents into the political structure of those countries and made them, less resolved about what to do and how to collaborate with the EU in general. So I would say that they haven't moved fast enough. They haven't shown the political will. They haven't raised the money. They haven't said they are making every effort, and they haven't said they have raised the money or improved their armies. Bottom line is it's all talk. It's all performative, and there's very little actually happening in terms of bringing Europe together. So I don't think Europe is a factor as it might have been, and I think that we have to discount it in the larger analysis here. And the larger analysis is about, as I said, both Putin and Trump are performative. They're on a stage, and it sounds a lot like a reality show, and they're looking for the headlines, because they know if they keep repeating themselves, whatever position they take, people will get bored and turn to other issues. So what we have here is the biggest, best, most interesting, most incredible, most unbelievable reality show the world has ever seen, and the media is complicit.
Right now, Ukraine is very concerned that summer is coming. The mud is dried up. It's getting hard. And they're worried that Russia is going to perform a major advance somewhere in the eastern part, the Donbass region, and have a major push. To what degree do you think, if Russia is successful in gaining more territory, does that evaporate any hopes for a ceasefire?
I think they will do that. I think they have friends in China, for example, and other countries that will help them do that, Iran. And I think they will take over the eastern part, the Donbass, and maybe other parts of Ukraine. I think at the end of the day, Ukraine is really not sustainable without help from Europe and without help from the U.S. How can that work? There are people who are very dedicated to helping. There are individuals from the United States who are actually in the Ukrainian army, but that's just a flash in the pan. The reality is they can't match the resources that Putin is throwing at them. And the troops that are willing, the Russian troops that are being sacrificed, is just not an even score. So what will happen here, and we can talk about the predictions and the like, is that Ukraine will be under tremendous pressure, probably by the summer, because nobody is bailing them out. And Ukraine may very well lose. So what does lose mean? It means not so much that Russia will make them into a neutral country. It means that Russia will have a puppet government. Russia will destroy whatever is left of their government and their military and their civil society. He will control them. They will become a satellite state for Russia. And that will be the end of the end of the Marshall Plan, the end of Europe as we have known it. And I am very concerned that will happen, and it will be our fault. And then the question is, how will the world feel about our fault? And I don't think the world cares that much about our fault. I mean, BRICS doesn't care. A lot of countries in Europe, they don't care. The American public doesn't really care. Congress doesn't care. And let me say that Lindsey Graham doesn't care. Not really. He's just looking to get on the headlines also. So I think we're in the middle of a world change, and I think Ukraine is right square in the middle of it. And when people step back a little bit and realize what has happened, what is really going on, when you really connect the dots and you take all the confusion out of it, Putin will have Ukraine, and that will change the liberal world order. It will become an illiberal world order.
Okay, thanks, Jay. Ben, Jay just dove headfirst into the question I was going to ask you, and that is, if the United States walks away, what happens to the reputation of the United States as a defender of democracy, a trusted partner? What impacts, if you follow Jay's line of discussion, which I happen to agree with, what happens when Ukraine is now run by a puppet government of the Soviet Union, Russia? And what impact will the world have towards the United States and how it deals with us? Is it lack of faith in our financial instruments? Is it lack of faith of asking the United States to support them in a military conflict? What do you see as the implications of us turning our back on Ukraine and letting Russia do as it please?
This is a very difficult question to try to answer. Okay. So, I would try to agree with Jay up to a point, okay, which is, I think that there is a certain level of disservice done to the actual Ukrainians in all these machinations. I mean, if you think they've been fighting for 3 years, and everybody thought it was going to be a 3-day event, and they've shown a lot of adaptability as they've fought, because they know Russia very well, right? So even though all these things seem so bleak, I'm one of those people who maybe some people will think are Pollyannish, but I don't underestimate the will of the Ukrainians to keep going literally to the last person with regards to fighting off what Putin wants to do. And in some sense, I'd say to all of us, this is one of the most moving, beautiful things we've ever seen in terms of an independence movement vis-a-vis the superpower games that we're all talking about here. The Ukrainians want to be Ukrainian in a Ukrainian way. And if they decide that they would want to be a part of NATO, they will ask. It's not the United States agreeing with Russia that they will not become part of NATO. That's not, it's a question of Ukraine saying, this is what we want. This is our destiny. And so I'm just, that's maybe something that I would just point out as sort of a different view. The second, and somebody may say I'm a romantic. The second thing is, I think that the United States has already lost, in a certain sense, any credibility in the world at this point. I mean, I watched King Charles up in Canada when he opened up Parliament there. And clearly he was talking for the idea of Canada doing economic and military relationships with other parts of the world, basically moving away, as we've heard the Canadians say, from the close ties to the United States. So the world is already moving beyond the United States. Now, in terms of NATO, you know, the only thing I would say about Europe is that Europe is what, 27, 28 states? You know, and they don't move as fast as we'd like, right? Okay, or you think you'd like. But that's part of the beauty of Europe. I'm sorry to say it like that, because it beats wars there. We've had a few wars there, and them getting their act together takes a certain amount of time. But I do think that when it comes down to it, they will find a way to support Ukraine and not bow down to Putin's ambitions. It could even go so far as Europe trying to come to ties with China, which is kind of another game that they could play, switching off for China between Russia or Europe. You know, business is business, right? So you know, I'm not as pessimistic as we can potentially be. That being said, I am saying that the United States had a chance when Biden came back to make the Trump 4 years just a sort of blip. But the thing is when Biden came back to power, he said, and in Europe he said, the United States is back. And the Europeans said, yes, but for how long?
Good point.
And that's the thing that they've seen 4 years later. We've seen, okay, well, we have to go in some other direction while maintaining who we are as a bunch of European states. And so that's, I think, where we're at. And congratulations to the United States for having the wisdom to put itself in this position. But I agree, a lot of people don't care about any of this stuff. But, you know, it's over the horizon. But, you know, I would just suggest that those things over the horizon come back to bite us quicker than we sometimes think sometimes.
Okay, great points you made. Chuck, one of the positions, and Jay said it quite well earlier on in the show, is that Putin has placed a demand that most likely is not going to be met, and therefore that allows Putin the leeway not to get anything done or do anything, particularly regards the ceasefire. And that is this idea that Ukraine shall never be part of NATO. What should the United States say to Putin about that? Because in 1990, Secretary James Baker said to Gorbachev, the United States will not expand. And that statement was confirmed by CIA Director William Burns in his memoir, saying, yeah, it was true that Secretary Baker did say that to Gorbachev, that NATO will not expand on its eastern borders. And of course, they did. But that was never formalized. What should the United States response be to Gorbachev, who is hanging on to this point, that the United States said they wouldn't expand, and they did, and they broke their word, versus what Director William Burns said, well, it was never formalized. Is that a good enough answer to quell Putin, or does Putin just hang on to it because he needs an excuse not to act?
Well, the other ground that needs to be mentioned was that was prior to the elimination of Russia's satellite republics,
Correct.
the USSR. And that geopolitical change is the one that has changed the whole dynamic. Had that not happened, Putin would not be in a position where he feels the need to start acquiring territories and subservient states back, Ukraine, Moldova, whichever other ones he can get, maybe Poland, others. So that's the concern for Europe, and that's why they're going to have to look at this completely differently than they did before. This is a territorial acquisition geopolitical war that is in part military and part economic, but it's all integrated into one combination of complex conflicts.
Well, that was a diplomatic way of saying, get off it, Vlad. You're barking up the wrong tree, because it was never formalized, and basically, too bad, so sad.
When Baker says NATO will not expand, or as opposed to NATO will never expand, I'm not sure which one of those to the east, okay? Because there is a language in diplomacy, which is to say things that mean exactly the opposite of what they seem to say. So I said, NATO will not expand to the east means NATO will expand to the east. Trust me. Trust me.
Especially if Russia is trying to expand to the east at the same time.
Yeah. And so, the Baker statement has got that diplomatic cutting two sides, okay? If you're listening to that statement as a Russian, you're not sure if it's really a commitment not to go to the east or it's a commitment to go to the east. It's the ambiguities,
Okay, but Putin is nested on this statement. It's his basis of argument for saying, you guys broke your word, and that was his validation for invading Ukraine. At what point do we say bullshit? Come on, knock it off.
You should say the language of diplomacy. That was merely the language of diplomacy.
Okay.
That's all. I mean, that's the way I'm telling you, folks, it's cruel. It's cruel at this level in these games between these people. Okay. That's all I can say.
Well, we've run out of time. We're going to go around the table. As you go around the table, just in the back of your mind, have the idea that, will we see a ceasefire or not in the next 30, 60, 90, 120 days? So let's go around the table. Let's start with you, Chuck.
Easy answer, no. But I think the bigger question is the one that we've kind of evolved to, which is what's going to happen in the complex dynamics of the changing geopolitical conflicts between and among Europe, Russia, the US, China, and others in that whole region. And it's capable of expansion beyond that region to include Taiwan, Asia, Philippines, and others.
Ben, you're up.
So I would say that there will not be a ceasefire. We may move from a hot war to, sort of like resistance, kinds of things within Ukraine. But I just have a sense of the Ukrainians having such a strong sense of their country that they will find a way to keep fighting somehow, some way. If the Russians somehow, quote unquote, succeed, put in puppet governments, things like that. It's like the French Vichy thing again. Okay.
Okay. Jay, you get the last word on this.
Resistance doesn't win wars. It didn't win wars in Vichy. It didn't win wars in the Warsaw Ghetto. If you remember, they were brave, they were courageous, and yet they were killed, pretty much nearly all of them. So if the US hadn't come in and dealt with the Nazis, we might have a Nazi Europe today. No kidding. But anyway, I just want to say that when you shake it and bake it here, he's winning and he's smart. He has the options all on his side of the court. Trump is doing his performance thing, and it's not helping. But really, here we are in American Issues, take one. And we have to look at how this whole affair with Ukraine is a part of the American decline. Because if you talk about all the things we've been covering over the past, well, since the inauguration, I suppose, you find that the U.S. is declining. Its federal government is declining. Its constitution, rule of law is declining. Its healthcare is declining. I could go on. It's declining, and it's declining geopolitically in the world. It's not only a matter of reputation, it's real decline. This tariff thing is not going to help. And the failure of its economy and its engagement in trade, global trade, is not going to help. On the other hand, Ukraine is a kind of canary in the coal mine. Ukraine is, whatever you want to say about the morality, the ethics of an invasion of your neighbor, whatever you want to say about the liberal world order, whatever you want to say about trying to preserve, the notions of the Marshall Plan reinforced at the end of the war. The fact is, that the U.S. is being measured, and it's not only taco. We have the chicken approach. Biden was a chicken about providing weapons to Ukraine. And this very day, we find that the Israelis bombed the airport in Yemen. You say to yourself, wait a minute, didn't Trump take the initiative about bombing the airport in Yemen? Wasn't he the one who was flying these fighter jets and other weapons off to Truman in order to neutralize Yemen? It's not him anymore. It's taco, it's chicken. So we can spend $4 billion more, make that 4 trillion, I'm sorry, on defense. We can build up the military to the level of lethality that he was talking about at West Point, but he's not going to use them because he's taco. And I'm very concerned about that. And I think the world itself has given up on us. You can talk about reputation, but if you say that Ukraine is not going to win this game, if you say that Ukraine is going to be taken over one way or the other by Russia, then you're saying that the U.S. is going to be taken over too. And our decline is going to become more obvious and more complete.
All right. Again, just to remind people what TACO stands for, believe it's Trump always chickens out. So it's no longer Taco Tuesday, it's Taco every day when it comes to Donald Trump at the podium. I'd like to thank my esteemed guest, Ben Davis, my other special esteemed guest, Chuck Crumpton, and my co-host, as always, Jay Fidell. I'm Tim Apicella, your host for American Issues Take One, and won't you please join us next week? And until then, aloha.